There was an explicit mention of ensuring that family businesses have needed capital. But I can tell you there was no use of the word labor or union or working class.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
The Alabama Democrats in the State House of Representatives here in Alabama, they had a big to-do last week about unveiling their legislative agenda. And, that seems like, I don't know, just on the face of it, as a super minority, you would think if you're going to have this big to-do, I mean, the Senate Dems didn't have one of these, right? It was just the House Dems.
That's right.
And so you would think if there's some big to-do that as a super minority, that this is mostly going to be, I mean, I don't know. The way that I think is that if I have no actual power to pass things, I'm going to be going, it's going to be all message bills. It's going to be big, bold, transformational, party defining and separating from the opposition party, which in this case would be the Republicans. We want to show how we are, because obviously, right, look, if Alabama voters want conservative policies, they're just going to keep voting Republicans for the Republicans, right? They're not going to vote for a Democrat if they want conservative policies. It would seem to me, it would seem to me that to vote Democrat, you want something different. You want something different. And so you want to define this difference in a real big and bold way. It just, that's how, that would be, I don't know, that would be the way that I would go. Is that kind of what they did?
Well, not quite. I would not say that. And, I went into it with a similar mindset as you. My position would be if you are in the super minority, meaning literally you do not have to show up.
Right.
They don't have to show up. The Republicans have enough votes to do whatever they want within their own caucus. So, yeah, I would have the same approach as you, but that is not the approach that was taken. If you read the recent op-ed from the House Democrats Minority Leader, Anthony Daniels, or you listened to our discussion of it a couple weeks ago, then you have a pretty good idea of how this agenda was framed. And we do have a couple clips we'll play for you to spell that out. But the House Democrats caucus is calling their legislative agenda the Plan for Prosperity. And if they said it once, they said it 100 times that this is a pro-growth agenda. As with the Daniels op-ed calling for a cut to the overtime tax, everything is couched in business-friendly language, and there's likely nothing that was said during the 50-minute press conference that would offend the Chamber of Commerce or the Business Council of Alabama. Now, that's not what I would personally call a, quote, bold agenda, as Daniels called it and others have labeled it. In fact, at one point, Daniels said he didn't see anything that should be problematic for his colleagues across the aisle within their agenda, which tells you that they confined their imaginations to what they thought was possible under a GOP supermajority. And, I get that strategy. No one runs for office and hopes to spend 4 years accomplishing nothing. So I do understand that, but to Jacob's point, my thinking is that when you are a super minority and the other side has the votes to do whatever they want, that's the time to be truly bold and to draw contrast because you have nothing to lose. But, that's just us. A couple quick hits before I get into the meat of it. I did want to highlight that Representative Laura Hall, a former career educator right here from Huntsville, she spoke on public education for a few minutes and handled the education side of their agenda. I thought everything she said was very solid, though nothing particularly new necessarily, but all good stuff. One thing she mentioned was establishing childcare for teachers. I think that's a great idea they should really lean into, and it would be a great use of all this so-called excess revenue that's in the education budget. if there's all this extra money, I could see, especially establishing a pilot program perhaps in certain areas. But why not? Why not establish child care centers within our school districts to serve the employees? Seems like a win-win scenario. So some good stuff on education, nothing groundbreaking, but, solid. Then we had Representative Hassel out of Montgomery, who spoke on voting rights. Let me see if I got that clip here to play for you, because I did want to highlight, obviously we're a little bit negative right out of the gate here, and I wanted to highlight that there were some things that I thought were pretty good. So let's take a listen here.
Help our young people understand the importance of good citizenship, community service, and civic engagement. Yet, like many of you, I couldn't help but notice that during our last election cycle, voter turnout was at a 30-year low. This is why it's so important that we make voting easier and more accessible. Rather than making the process more difficult under the false pretense of preserving election integrity or preventing non-existent voter fraud, as our Secretary of State has proudly asserted publicly, we know that our election process in Alabama is safe, secure, and accurate. Now it's time to ensure that the voices of all eligible voters are heard. Alabama House Democrats understand that our constitutional right to vote is free, fair, and honest elections and the cornerstone of our democracy. This is essential to our common prosperity. We must enact legislation to allow for automatic voter registration at the age of 18, curbside voting, early voting, and guaranteed absentee voting. Furthermore, we must restore voting rights to those who have paid their debt to society. This means removing redundant and burdensome court fees or fines as a condition to regaining the freedom to vote. We could and should make voting easier, increase voter participation on all eligible voters, as we can do more while ensuring and safeguarding integrity within our election process. The people of Alabama deserve to have their voices heard and votes counted, which means supporting voter education efforts and ensuring that the elderly.
So yeah, I wanted to highlight that from Representative Hassel because he did at least acknowledge the low voter turnout, which I appreciated. I believe that low voter turnout in Alabama goes well beyond our restrictive laws, but I think he spoke effectively to the need to make voting easier in the state rather than trying to make it harder while fighting imaginary fraud. So I was glad to hear that brought up. At one point later in the press conference, Representative Moore from Birmingham mentioned how her bills often never even get a committee hearing, and that's a testament to some of the poor governance by the Alabama Republican supermajority. We'll see if things change now. There are, several dozen new legislators down there in Montgomery, so, we'll see if they take a different approach, but, I don't see any harm in allowing bills to be heard in committee. That seems pretty shameful. Representative Insler, who is a new Democratic legislator, spoke on the need for criminal justice reform. He advocated for several bills being pushed by Representative Chris England, who has really, been on top of that issue as a priority for him. And he called out the inhumane conditions in Alabama's prisons. And I was glad to see that get mentioned. There were actually families of prisoners who were outside the State House during Governor Ivey's State of the State address. These were families who've lost loved ones to the violence inside of our prisons. So, I appreciate that was at least mentioned. But I should also say that throughout his segment, he was very careful to align with law enforcement multiple times. Most of what he discussed, particularly regarding guns, he was very much framing them as on the side of law enforcement. So that's the approach they're taking in that arena. And then we get to really the meat of it, which was really towards the front. They started with economics. And so I want to play this clip for you guys just to see sort of how things were framed rhetorically, if nothing else.
So important that we prioritize investments in infrastructure and that we expend federal ARPA dollars with a focus on long-term growth and prudent revitalization. Alabama House Democrats strongly believe in ensuring that businesses, large and small, have the necessary capital, qualified personnel, and meaningful resources they need to prosper and thrive. Our pro-growth economic plan of bold strategic investments includes reducing the tax burden on family-owned businesses, ensuring greater access to affordable housing, and incentivizing childcare for parents returning to the workforce. We must continue our efforts to close the income gap and bolster training opportunities to meet the specialized and evolving demands of innovative, high-tech employers. Further,
So you see, there was an explicit mention of ensuring that, family businesses have needed capital. But I can tell you in the 50 minutes of the press conference, there was no use of the word labor or union or working class. At one point later in the press conference, with some back and forth between journalists, there was a discussion of Medicaid expansion, and I will give Representative Daniels credit. He did say the words working poor in reference to Medicaid expansion, since that is primarily who would benefit. But yeah, it was, an economic agenda, an economic discussion that never actually mentioned working class, unions, labor. We've had some very high-profile union contract campaigns and union organization campaigns here in the state in the last couple of years. We've had, a historic strike that is coming to a close. We've had a lot of labor unrest in the state of Alabama, and that was totally absent from this discussion. If you look at what they're pushing, the primary policies beyond Medicaid expansion would be the grocery tax and the overtime tax. House Democrats are again pushing to cut the grocery tax as well as the tax on overtime pay. And you also heard some mention of infrastructure as well. I've discussed on the show before, but Alabama's tax system is highly inadequate and highly regressive. We are 49th in tax collection, but 50th if you factor in lottery and gambling, which is actually noticeably absent from the House Democrats' agenda this year. And the burden of taxes and fees that we do have fall disproportionately on the working class of Alabama rather than the wealthy and the big businesses that are most able to afford it. A removal on the taxes of groceries and overtime, that would be a welcome relief for working class Alabamians, and it would begin to address the regressive nature of our tax structure. To me, it appears like the Alabama House Democrats are telling Republicans, hey, since you guys seem to love tax cuts so much, we dare you to cut taxes for low and middle income people. And maybe they will. Maybe they will accept the challenge. One idea that's being put forth in these conversations is that cutting the grocery tax and the overtime tax wouldn't actually hurt the state's revenues. The theory is that people will spend that saved money elsewhere, and the economic activity stimulated by the cuts will bring in enough revenue to offset the lost taxes. In fact, House Minority Anthony Daniels was praised by right-wing radio host Michael Yaffe for his supposed advocacy of supply-side economics. Credit to Jacob for finding that little nugget. And in fairness, this is not a direct parallel to the typical, Reaganist Republican supply-side tax theory. Rather than cutting taxes for those at the top and pretending that the wealth will trickle down, these tax cuts would be felt the most among the bottom and the middle, growing the economy up and out from there. Ultimately, I can't say for certain whether it will pan out this way, where, new revenues will offset lost tax collections. I can't say that's how it's going to work, and frankly, I'm not sure if the legislators could really say that either. But at the end of the day, generally speaking, more money in the pockets of working people is a good thing. It's a good thing for working people, and it's a good thing for the economy. But, quite obviously, this does nothing to address the inadequacy of the tax structure in the state. If their entire agenda was enacted, it wouldn't change the fact that we're 49th or 50th in tax collection. What does that mean? Well, it means we have the worst services provided by the state of any state in the country. Infrastructure, education, you name it, healthcare, you name the aspect of public service, and our agencies are understaffed, underfunded, sabotaged, and unable to really meet the needs of the people. Just last year, there were 18 new laws that were passed that lowered the state's revenues by $160 million a year going forward. Right? There's more tax cuts we know are going to be on the way. There's rebates that are being floated out as ideas. The economy has been okay in terms of tax collections, right? That's why there's a surplus in the general fund and the education trust fund. But let's not pretend like that's going to last forever. The budgets have benefited generously from federal infusions of cash through COVID relief, through the American Rescue Plan Act. We've seen, spending has continued to accelerate because we have inflation. And as prices have risen on consumer goods, that has meant consumers are paying higher taxes, right? As they check out at the grocery store, at Walmart, wherever. So tax collections are looking fairly good, and that's why we have these surpluses. But those surpluses are not going to last forever. You're talking about decades of underinvestment in the state, right? So even with some pretty eye-popping numbers right now, even those nice surpluses aren't enough to undo years of underinvestment. So I would just caution those in the legislature to be mindful of how the budget can change and how the economy can change. Because as we're having this discussion, the Federal Reserve is doing everything it can to spike unemployment, right? That's not a secret. That's not a conspiracy. That's what their own documentation says. Their goal is to spike unemployment. And historically, doing what they're doing results in a recession every time. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the show. But I thought that was important context. That's important context to these budget discussions. So all in all, are there some decent policies being proposed? Yes. I think most working people would gladly take a tax cut on groceries and overtime. But there's a lot more that needs to be done in the state of Alabama. And if your quote-unquote bold agenda is so amenable to the other side that they're not going to find any problems with it, if your bold agenda is so bold that it could have come out of a communications department of the Chamber of Commerce, yeah, I don't know. I just feel like that's a missed opportunity to paint a different picture, to put forward a different vision of what Alabama could look like if we were serious about growing Alabama from the bottom up.
Absolutely. And the critics of our approach would say that, sure, but doing that isn't going to make anybody's life better right now. And that is, and I understand that. And I'm not even saying that's wrong. Obviously, putting forward a big, bold agenda that will empower working people, that'll give folks health care, that'll make sure folks have housing, all these important things. That's not going to pass in this legislative session, but it does open conversations, and it increases people's imagination of what could happen. And but they're not exclusionary. They're not exclusionary at all. You can propose these big, bold things while at the same time working on actually achievable things that are not big and that are not bold, but will make thousands of people's lives better. And
Right.
that's not anything to turn your nose up at, certainly, and I don't want to do that, but I think it's important to do both things at the same time, and we're not seeing that from the Alabama House Democrats.
Yeah, and that would be how I close this conversation. Is this is fine as an agenda of what you think might be able to move forward in the legislature as it currently exists, but that is not the same as a vision of a different Alabama, and I think you need both.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.
Which side are you